A German Shepherd puppy sat just a few feet away from a Navy SEAL, staring straight at him, yet ignoring every word he said. David Morgan had spent years giving commands people understood the first time, but Cooper was different. He ignored his name, slept across David's laptop, crossed every boundary in the house like the rules had never existed. David thought he had adopted the most stubborn puppy in Virginia. Then, one afternoon, Cooper slipped loose and wandered toward a moving truck. David shouted. Cooper never turned around. Why couldn't the puppy hear him? And if commands were useless, how could David keep him safe? This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Late spring had settled gently over Charlottesville, Virginia, with cool air lingering beneath a pale morning sky and the Blue Ridge Mountains appearing as soft blue shadows beyond the town. David Morgan parked his dark pickup beside the Albemarle County Animal Care Center, with the engine still running for several seconds after he arrived. At 43, David was still an active-duty Navy SEAL, though his current assignment kept him mostly on shore, helping train younger operators rather than deploying with them. He stood 6 feet 2 inches, broad through the shoulders and narrow at the waist, with the lean strength of a man whose body had spent decades being treated less like something to admire than a piece of equipment that had to work when required. His dark brown hair was cut close, silver beginning to gather at both temples, and a neatly trimmed beard sharpened a square jaw already made severe by a faint scar beneath his chin. Strangers often found David easy to trust. He spoke politely, remembered names, held doors, and had the dry humor of someone accustomed to keeping tense rooms from becoming unbearable. But people who knew him longer usually discovered the harder part. David needed things to make sense. He liked problems with causes, consequences, and preferably a checklist between the two. Years earlier, during a training exercise, he had dismissed a younger sailor's hesitation because the numbers, timing, and procedure all told David the plan was sound. An accident followed. The sailor survived and recovered, but David never forgot the sight of the man being carried away. The lesson David took from it was not that certainty could fail. He concluded instead that he needed more certainty, better preparation, better systems, fewer variables. That morning, the truck bed behind him contained 11 folded blankets, 2 sealed bags of dog food, cleaning supplies, and several boxes of donated toys, collected by men from his training unit. He intended to unload them, sign whatever paper was necessary, and leave. Inside, the shelter smelled of disinfectant, kibble, damp fur, and the strange, nervous energy produced by animals waiting for lives they could not understand. Melissa Grant met David near the reception desk. She was 38, short and sturdy, with warm brown skin, dark curls tied into an untidy knot, and rectangular glasses she was forever pushing back up her nose. Melissa had worked at the shelter for 12 years and possessed the unusual kindness of someone who had learned not to confuse kindness with sentimentality. She loved animals fiercely, but she did not tell every visitor that every dog was perfect. 11 blankets? She asked, as David carried in the final box. Your guys planning to make us the Ritz-Carlton? They were instructed to donate useful items, David said. One of them tried to send a beanbag chair. Melissa stared at him. For the dogs? He said morale matters. I like him already. David almost smiled. Then something brown and black shot across the end of the hallway. The puppy was perhaps 4 months old and looked as though several parts of him had been ordered in different sizes. His paws were enormous, his body long and still slightly awkward, and one ear stood upright while the other leaned sideways as if undecided about adulthood. His coat was classic German Shepherd black and tan, darker along his back, with warm caramel fur running down his chest and legs. A dark mask surrounded his brown eyes and tapered toward a black muzzle still too soft to look intimidating. He was not starving, but he was lean from recent weeks without a stable home. Melissa barely had time to say, "Cooper," before the puppy passed her, ignored David completely, and seized the work glove protruding from David's back pocket. David turned. Cooper trotted 3 yards away, dropped onto the floor, placed both front paws over the stolen glove, and began chewing its thumb. "That belongs to me," David said. Cooper did not look up. Melissa folded her arms. "Strong opening argument." David crouched. "Come here." Nothing. "Cooper." Nothing. David clicked his tongue and extended one hand. Cooper finally lifted his head, but his attention seemed to land not on David's face, but on the grocery-sized donation bag beside him. Melissa took a small treat from her pocket. Cooper noticed immediately. He abandoned the glove and trotted over. "So he understands bribery," David said. "Most of us do." Melissa explained that Cooper had been found wandering near a home improvement store parking lot 10 days earlier. No collar, no microchip. Nobody had claimed him. He had been medically cleared and was now available for adoption. "German Shepherd," David said, studying the oversized paws. "Mostly, as far as we can tell." "I drive?" "Depends what you're driving toward. Food? Definitely." David watched Cooper investigate the box of toys, lose interest, return to the glove, and then lie directly on top of it. There was no soulful stare between them, no cinematic moment in which the animal recognized his destined human. Cooper seemed perfectly content to steal from David without forming an emotional opinion about him. That indifference should have made leaving easier. Instead, it bothered David enough to keep him standing there. He was accustomed to dogs that watched handlers closely, working shepherds whose attention could feel almost unnervingly precise. Cooper treated him like furniture with pockets. 20 minutes later, David was still there. 40 minutes later, Melissa slid an adoption form across the counter. "You understand," she said carefully. "You came here to donate blankets." David looked through the glass partition. Cooper was upside down in a plastic bed, chewing something that had probably once been intended as a rope toy. "I'm aware." "Just checking," David signed. He told himself the decision was practical. His current assignment was predictable. He had a fenced yard. He exercised daily. German Shepherds benefited from structure, and structure happened to be the one resource David possessed in unreasonable quantities. What he did not admit was that Cooper's complete lack of interest in impressing him had touched something stubborn in David. Humans often called curiosity by nobler names when they wanted to justify changing their lives. Before taking Cooper home, David stopped at Second Draft, a narrow former stationery shop on a side street lined with maple trees. The faded gold lettering from the previous business still clung to the front window. Inside, his older sister, Laura Morgan, stood surrounded by paint cans, stacked paper samples, exposed shelves, and exactly the sort of disorder David found physically uncomfortable. Laura was 50, 7 years older than him, 5'5" and slender, with pale freckled skin, hazel eyes, and thick auburn-brown hair, now streaked liberally with silver and twisted behind her head with a pencil. For 23 years, she had worked in insurance administration, becoming so reliable that colleagues came to her with problems nobody else wanted. 6 months earlier, she had resigned and invested much of her savings into a small letterpress studio she planned to call Second Draft. Laura could be warm, quick-witted, and enormously generous, but she also possessed an independent streak that turned granite hard whenever someone suggested she had not thought something through. David entered carrying Cooper under one arm for exactly 6 seconds before the puppy began wriggling. Laura stared. "You went to donate blankets." "Correct." "And somehow came back with a German Shepherd." "Also correct." "I'm afraid to ask what happens when you donate blood." David set Cooper down. The puppy immediately walked past Laura, sniffed a stack of expensive cotton paper, and sneezed on it. David had originally promised to help move 2 cabinets. Instead, within 20 minutes, he was reviewing Laura's renovation budget. "You don't need the antique display table." "I like the antique display table." "It costs $800. "It is beautiful." Beautiful isn't a financial category. Laura leaned against a workbench. Neither is joy, but somehow people keep spending money on birthdays. David continued through his spreadsheet. Electrical work, paper storage, restoration of the old press, signage, lighting. He had sorted everything into necessary, optional, and postpone. Laura watched her brother reduce a dream she had carried quietly for years into 3 colored columns. She knew why he did it. David loved by preparing. He worried by organizing. He became frightened by making lists, so competent nobody could tell he was frightened. But knowing why someone behaved a certain way did not always make the behavior easier to endure. "I asked you to move cabinets," she said. David looked up. "I'm trying to make sure you don't burn through your savings. And I'm trying to build something before I spend the rest of my life wondering whether I was brave enough to try." The room went quiet. David closed the laptop halfway, not because he agreed, but because he sensed the conversation had reached a place numbers would only make worse. Cooper broke the silence by emerging from beneath a table with a roll of blue painter's tape in his mouth. By evening, David's house had become the site of a campaign Cooper had not agreed to join. David placed the food bowl beside the kitchen island, positioned the crate against the living room wall, stored shoes behind a closed door, moved electrical cords, and established boundaries. He called Cooper from the hallway. The puppy continued sniffing a chair leg. "Cooper!" Nothing. David clapped twice. Cooper did not even flick an ear. 30 seconds later, David opened a bag of treats almost silently, and the puppy turned at once. "Interesting," David murmured. He interpreted it through the framework available to him: selective attention, stubbornness. A clever dog already learning which commands were profitable. Near the kitchen entrance, David pulled out the roll of blue painter's tape Cooper had stolen at Laura's shop and laid a straight line across the floor. "This side," he told the puppy, pointing toward the living room. "Your side. Kitchen stays clear." Cooper looked briefly at David's hand, wandered away, drank water, attacked one of his own hind feet, and eventually disappeared behind the sofa. David allowed himself the quiet satisfaction of a man who had established the first rule of a new system. 10 minutes later, he returned from the laundry room and stopped. Cooper was stretched directly across the blue line, belly on the tape, chin resting between oversized paws. His back half occupied the living room, his front half occupied the forbidden kitchen. One ear stood upright, the other remained folded. His eyes were already drifting closed. David leaned against the counter and watched him. "We're going to have to agree on a few rules." Cooper did not move. "Preferably ones you acknowledge exist." Still nothing. David shook his head, almost smiling, and turned off the kitchen light. He thought he had brought home a stubborn puppy. He thought the problem would be solved through consistency, repetition, and better commands. There was one possibility David had not considered, because human beings often assume silence means refusal before wondering whether they have ever truly been heard. Cooper had not ignored every word spoken to him that day. He simply may not have heard most of them at all. By the following morning, David Morgan had converted Cooper's arrival from an unexpected adoption into something he understood much better: a schedule. Breakfast at 7, walk 20 minutes later, quiet time after exercise, a second walk before dinner, no sofa, no kitchen, no shoes, no laptop, no chewing anything that had not been specifically purchased for chewing. David printed the routine on a single sheet and attached it to the refrigerator with a magnet, though Cooper could neither read it nor appreciate the confidence with which it had been designed. For David, routine was not merely convenience. Routine was insurance against chaos. He had spent much of his adult life in environments where an overlooked detail could become an injury, a failed operation, or a phone call to somebody's family. Cooper, however, appeared to regard consistency as an interesting theory. On the first morning, the puppy ate at 7 precisely, which pleased David until Cooper stole one of his socks at 7:10 and carried it beneath the dining table. At 8, David placed him in the living room with a rubber chew toy. Cooper climbed onto the forbidden sofa instead. By noon, he had pushed David's laptop lid shut with one oversized paw and gone to sleep against it. "You have your own bed," David told him. Cooper opened one brown eye, then closed it again. David had worked with stubborn people before. Stubbornness, in his experience, usually yielded to repetition. The trouble was that Cooper's behavior did not remain consistently stubborn. Sometimes he seemed astonishingly attentive. David could stand across the room holding a small piece of boiled chicken, and Cooper's entire body would sharpen toward him. The upright ear forward, the half-folded ear twitching slightly, eyes locked on David's hand. Yet 15 minutes later, David could call his name 3 times from behind and get nothing. "Cooper!" No response. "Cooper!" The puppy continued investigating a crack between 2 floorboards. David clapped once. Nothing. He walked around until he entered Cooper's field of vision, and suddenly the puppy looked up as if David had materialized from nowhere. "So now you see me." Cooper wagged once, casually, and returned to the floorboard. At first, David found it amusing. By the 3rd day, amusement had begun to fray around the edges. Cooper discovered that the blue tape across the kitchen was not physically capable of stopping him, which apparently reduced its legal authority considerably. David redirected him 6 times in one afternoon. On the 7th, Cooper sat directly across the line and stared at him. "You know exactly what you're doing," David said. Cooper sneezed. David became convinced the dog had selective attention, something he had seen in young working dogs before: environmental fixation, poor impulse control, insufficient engagement with the handler. Those were manageable problems. He began using short sessions in the backyard, rewarding eye contact and simple responses. When Cooper happened to be looking at him, progress came quickly. The puppy learned that sitting could produce chicken with almost suspicious enthusiasm. But the moment Cooper turned away, the connection disappeared. David increased the clarity of his voice, then the volume, then the repetition. Human beings often become louder when understanding fails, as though volume can repair a message that never arrived. David did not recognize himself doing it. On the 4th afternoon, he stopped by Second Draft after training. Laura was standing on a wooden stepladder beneath an open ceiling panel, studying a bundle of aging electrical wires with an expression suggesting they had personally offended her. She wore faded jeans, a loose gray work shirt rolled to the elbows, and her auburn and silver hair was tied back with a strip of cloth because she had misplaced the pencil she usually used. Cooper wandered behind David on leash, immediately interested in a cardboard box filled with paper scraps. "No," David said. Cooper kept walking. David tugged the leash lightly and redirected him. Laura glanced down. "Going well?" "Define well." "Nobody bleeding?" "Yet." Laura climbed down and handed David 2 estimates for the electrical work. The first came from a local electrician she had known for years, a one-man operation with a simple handwritten breakdown of labor and materials. The second, which David had requested himself, came from a larger regional company and included inspection schedules, warranty terms, liability coverage, projected timelines, and 6 pages of language that made David feel calmer simply by existing. "The second one," he said. "You read them for 12 seconds. "I read both last night when they emailed them." Laura folded her arms. "Of course you did." David pointed to the larger company's estimate. "Documented inspection, better warranty. If they uncover additional damage, they have 3 crews available. And they cost almost 40% more. You're rewiring a building from the 1950s. Cheap isn't the goal. Neither is paying for an entire company's matching vans. That's not what you're paying for. You know what I mean." David did know. He also thought she was wrong. Laura preferred the local electrician because he had repaired wiring in neighboring shops and understood the peculiarities of the old block. David preferred the company that gave him more paper, more contingencies, and fewer unknowns. They had argued about money before, but this argument carried an irritation left over from their conversation in Chapter 1. David kept presenting reasons. Laura kept telling him she had already heard them. "I'm trying to keep you from spending twice when something goes wrong. And I'm trying to tell you that I've made a decision. Based on what? Experience, trust, budget. The same things adults have been using since before spreadsheets." David's jaw tightened. "Trust doesn't replace electrical code." "Oh, for heaven's sake, David, nobody said it did." Cooper had settled beside a stack of flattened boxes and was watching Laura because she happened to be facing him. David was not watching Cooper. "I'm giving you information," he said. "No." Laura's voice lost its humor. "You're waiting for me to surrender." That stopped him. Laura was rarely dramatic, and when she became quiet instead of sarcastic, David knew he had pushed farther than usual. She placed both estimates on the counter. "You always listen for the part you can fix. Do you ever listen just to know what another person is actually saying?" David looked at his sister. Somewhere in his mind, several answers formed at once: that he was trying to protect her savings, that she had never owned a business, that old wiring could become dangerous, that being careful was not the same as being controlling. Every answer sounded reasonable. None answered the question. Laura picked up a paintbrush and returned to the wall. David stood there for another moment, irritated partly with her and partly because the question had found a place inside him that did not have a neat response. That evening, Cooper gave the question sharper teeth. David was sitting at the dining table reviewing training notes when the puppy came behind his chair and began chewing the edge of one house slipper. "Leave it." Cooper kept chewing. "Cooper, leave it." Nothing. David turned and took the slipper away. Cooper looked mildly offended, then wandered toward the living room. Minutes later, David found him halfway onto the sofa. "Off." Cooper continued climbing. David stepped closer and touched him between the shoulders from behind. Cooper exploded around so quickly that David barely understood the movement before teeth caught the sleeve of his shirt. The bite did not break skin. It was not sustained aggression. The instant Cooper saw David, his body changed. He released the fabric and backed away, ears shifting, eyes wide, breathing fast. David froze. Cooper froze with him. For several seconds, the room contained something neither man nor dog knew how to interpret. David looked at the damp tooth marks on his sleeve. His first reaction was anger. His second was professional concern. A German shepherd that startled into its teeth could become dangerous as it grew. Cooper would soon weigh 60, 70, perhaps 80 pounds. Affection did not erase risk. Neither did good intentions. People often romanticized rescued animals because they wanted love to function like a cure. David knew better than that. A dog could be frightened and still hurt someone. A person could mean well and still make a bad decision. He sat down slowly while Cooper remained across the room, watching him now with complete attention. "What am I missing?" David asked. Cooper stared back. Over the next 2 days, David watched more carefully. Not more patiently yet, patience would come later, but more analytically. Cooper reacted when the refrigerator opened, but perhaps he noticed movement. He reacted when a heavy door slammed, though David could not tell whether it was the sound or the vibration through the floor. He ignored the vacuum cleaner until it entered his vision, then jumped sideways so violently that David shut it off immediately. When Laura visited, she called Cooper from behind while he was drinking water. Nothing. She moved to his side and waved. Cooper looked up at once. "That's strange," Laura said. David disliked how much relief he felt hearing somebody else say it. Strange meant observable. Observable meant solvable. 1 week after the adoption, a mild afternoon brought them into the fenced front yard. David had clipped Cooper's leash to a metal ground anchor while he cleared a pile of trimmed branches beside the porch. Cooper occupied himself with a fallen maple leaf, pouncing on it every time the breeze moved it. David was carrying branches toward the side gate when he heard a metallic snap. He turned. The leash was loose on the grass. The clip at the ground anchor had failed to seat properly and slipped free. Cooper was already moving toward the open driveway. "Cooper!" The puppy kept going. David dropped the branches. Beyond the driveway ran a narrow residential street where a delivery truck was approaching from the left. "Cooper!" David shouted. Across the street, a gray-haired woman tending flower pots beside her porch looked up sharply. Cooper did not. He stepped off the grass toward the pavement. David ran. "Cooper!" The puppy continued forward, head lowered toward something near the curb, utterly unaware of the urgency behind him. David crossed the distance in seconds and caught the loose leash just before Cooper reached the street. The truck passed with a rush of tires and diesel air. Cooper startled only when David's hand closed around the leash and pulled him back. David dropped to one knee, heart hammering far harder than the short sprint justified. Anger rose first because fear often wore that face on him. "What is wrong with you?" he demanded. Cooper looked at him now, confused but attentive. David stopped. The truck had been loud. His own shout had been loud enough to bring a neighbor's attention from across the street. Cooper had been less than 20 feet away. David looked at the puppy, then slowly toward the road where the truck was disappearing. He thought of the clapping, the vacuum, the bite when touched from behind. The way Cooper noticed chicken in David's hand but not his voice from another room. The way he became attentive whenever David entered his field of vision. A different explanation assembled itself, piece by piece, and David felt something cold settle beneath his ribs. Perhaps Cooper was not choosing which commands deserved obedience. Perhaps the dog had never heard those commands clearly enough to make a choice at all. The morning after the incident by the road, Charlottesville felt unusually still beneath a thin gray sky, the kind of late spring morning when the air carried the smell of wet pavement and young leaves. David Morgan had slept badly. Not because Cooper had made noise. Cooper rarely made much noise at all. But because the scene kept replaying in his mind with brutal simplicity. The truck, the loose leash, his own voice cutting across the yard, the gray-haired neighbor turning toward him from across the street, Cooper continuing forward as if David had not existed. By breakfast, David had stopped trying to explain it as disobedience. He called a veterinary clinic recommended by the shelter and took the first available appointment. Dr. Hannah Pierce met them in a bright examination room that smelled faintly of alcohol wipes and dog treats. Hannah was 46, tall and narrow-shouldered, with fair skin, green-gray eyes, and straight, dark blonde hair cut just above her shoulders. A pair of reading glasses rested on top of her head, even though David quickly noticed she rarely used them. She had the calm economy of movement that came from nearly 20 years in veterinary medicine, and she spoke in a low, even voice that never became sugary around frightened animals. Hannah had learned early in her career that nervous owners often needed honesty more than reassurance, and nervous animals needed space more than affection. She crouched several feet from Cooper instead of immediately reaching for him. Cooper watched her closely. One ear stood upright, the other tipped slightly outward. 4 months? Hannah asked. Approximately. And you've had him a week? 8 days. Tell me what you've noticed, not what you think it means, just what happens. David respected the distinction. He described the missed calls, the lack of response to clapping, the vacuum cleaner, the incident when Cooper startled and caught his sleeve, and finally the road. He was careful not to embellish anything, yet he heard the accusation in his own earlier interpretation when he said, "I thought he was choosing when to listen." Hannah nodded without judging him. That's a common assumption. She began with simple observations. While Cooper was facing David, Hannah made a soft clicking sound behind him. No movement. She shifted position and dropped a light metal instrument into a padded tray. Cooper did not turn. Then she stepped heavily enough for a faint vibration to pass through the floor. Cooper's head came up immediately. Hannah repeated a few variations, always making sure Cooper could not see what produced them. A higher-pitched sound caused one ear to twitch, but there was no reliable orientation toward it. When Hannah moved into his line of sight, however, Cooper became alert at once, following her hand as she moved it from side to side. "He's using his eyes heavily," she said. "That doesn't prove hearing loss by itself, but with what you've described, I'd want a proper auditory evaluation." David folded his arms. "How proper?" "A Baer test would tell us much more. It measures electrical activity in the auditory pathway in response to sound. We can arrange it through the specialty clinic we work with." David's mind immediately reached for the things he understood: appointment time, cost, degree, prognosis. "If he is deaf, can it be fixed?" Hannah did not answer too quickly. "That depends on the cause, and fixed may not be the most useful word. If this is congenital sensory neural hearing loss, which I suspect, it may be permanent. But permanent doesn't mean unmanageable." The specialty assessment was arranged sooner than David expected. By early afternoon, after additional testing, the answer had become clearer than he wanted. Cooper had severe bilateral hearing impairment, likely congenital. He appeared able to detect limited frequencies and some vibration, but spoken commands could not be relied upon as a primary means of communication. Hannah sat with David afterward and explained the result without dramatizing it. Cooper was not living in total silence, but his experience of sound was fragmented and inconsistent. Some noises reached him weakly, others did not reach him in any meaningful way. "So when I called him from behind," David began. He may not have known anything was happening. "And the sleeve? Imagine spending your day in a world where people appear beside you without warning. If you touch him suddenly from behind, especially while he's focused or resting, a startle response makes sense. That doesn't mean we ignore teeth. We still manage it carefully. But context matters." David looked through the half-open door toward Cooper, who was lying on the floor beside a technician's shoes, watching every movement in the hallway.
"I thought he was stubborn."
Hannah's expression stayed neutral. "He probably is sometimes." David looked at her. "That's not the diagnosis?" "German Shepherd puppy, 4 months old. I'd be shocked if stubborn never enters the picture." David gave a short laugh to spite himself. Hannah continued, "The difference is that now you need to separate what he cannot perceive from what he chooses not to do. Those are very different problems." That distinction followed David all the way home. It was easier to hear than to accept. He had spent 8 days interpreting Cooper through the habits of a man accustomed to clear commands and measurable responses. If someone did not respond, David repeated the instruction. If performance failed, he looked for a training error. If the system did not work, he made the system tighter. What unsettled him was not merely that he had been wrong about Cooper. People were wrong every day.
What unsettled him was how quickly he had converted something he did not understand into a flaw in somebody else. Stubborn, selective, difficult, potentially unsuitable. Human beings did that with one another too, he realized. They called people rude when they were overwhelmed, lazy when they were exhausted, distant when they were afraid, and difficult when they refused to behave in ways that made everyone else comfortable. Sometimes those judgments were correct. Often they were simply convenient. By the time David pulled into his driveway, Cooper was asleep in the passenger side footwell, unaware that the man beside him had spent the entire ride being quietly embarrassed by himself. Late that afternoon, Laura called. David almost let the phone ring twice before answering. "What happened?" "That is a remarkably comforting way to answer your sister. You only use that tone when something happened." Laura exhaled. "Second draft is over budget." "How much?" 28%, assuming the electrician doesn't find another surprise behind a wall. David was already reaching for his laptop. "Send me the revised estimates." I did. He opened the email while Laura began explaining. The electrical work was worse than expected. Part of one wall needed to be opened. A section of flooring might have to come up. The old press required a dedicated circuit. David's eyes moved through the numbers and automatically began ranking expenses. Essential, optional, postpone, eliminate. His fingers found the keyboard. Then Laura stopped speaking. "You there?" "Yes." "You went quiet." David looked at the spreadsheet appearing on his screen. He remembered second draft. He remembered the way Cooper had kept walking toward the street while David's voice grew louder and louder behind him. He remembered Hannah saying that an instruction could not work if it never arrived. David closed the laptop.
Laura?
Yeah?
Do you want me to help solve it, or do you want me to listen first? Silence followed. For one irrational second, David wondered whether the call had dropped. Then Laura said much more softly, "Listen first." So he did. Laura talked for nearly 10 minutes. She talked about the money, but not only the money. She admitted that the new electrical estimate frightened her because second draft had stopped feeling like an experiment and started feeling real enough to fail. She confessed she had imagined opening day so many times that every delay now felt personal. She worried that leaving insurance at 50 had been courageous only in the romantic version of the story, while the practical version might simply be a woman spending her savings because she had grown tired of fluorescent offices. David heard at least 6 moments where he could have interrupted with a solution. He heard 3 factual misunderstandings he could have corrected. He heard one expense he already knew should be cut. He said nothing. It was astonishingly uncomfortable. David had sat through operational briefings where careers depended on the decisions being made. He had waited through long nights when plans changed by the minute. Somehow listening to his sister without repairing her sentences required a different kind of discipline. When Laura finally stopped, David asked, "Done? For now? Okay." Another pause. "You didn't tell me what to do. You asked me to listen. I know, it's unsettling. You complained when I didn't. I reserve the right to complain when you improve." David smiled. Fair. Laura asked about Cooper, and David told her the diagnosis. Her voice changed immediately. "Oh, David, he's fine. I didn't say he wasn't." David looked toward the living room. Cooper was gnawing the corner of a rubber toy with great concentration. "I've spent a week getting annoyed at him for not answering me." "You didn't know?" "No." Laura waited. David almost wished she would excuse him more completely. Instead, she said, "Now you do." It was exactly the response he needed and not the one that made him comfortable. That evening, David left the television off. The house felt different, though nothing inside it had changed. The same sofa, the same kitchen, the same blue painter's tape still marking the floor. Cooper was the same dog he had been yesterday. The diagnosis had changed David's understanding, not Cooper's reality. David sat cross-legged on the living room floor, several feet away. Cooper lay near the coffee table, facing sideways. "Cooper?" Nothing. David called again, more softly this time. No response. He clapped once. Cooper remained still. There was no frustration in David now, only observation. He watched the puppy breathe, watched one oversized paw twitch against the rug, watched the upright ear move faintly when a delivery truck passed outside, perhaps responding to a vibration more than the sound itself. Then David lifted one hand into Cooper's field of vision. The puppy's head rose immediately, brown eyes fixed on him. David kept his hand still. Cooper watched. No command had been taught. No system existed yet. There was only attention, given because the message had finally arrived in a form Cooper could receive. David glanced toward the small toolbox beside the wall. The roll of blue painter's tape rested on top. For the first time since bringing Cooper home, David did not wonder how he could make the dog function inside his world. He wondered what it would take to learn how Cooper's world worked. The days that followed did not make Cooper easier. They made him clearer. David Morgan began to understand that those were not the same thing. Early summer was beginning to warm Charlottesville, and the mornings arrived bright over the Blue Ridge foothills, carrying the smell of cut grass through the open kitchen windows. David had spent most of his adult life believing communication improved when instructions became shorter, cleaner, and more precise. With Cooper, even the clearest spoken command was useless if it entered a channel the puppy could barely receive. So David started again. He read material recommended by Dr. Hannah Pierce, watched demonstrations from trainers experienced with deaf dogs, and reduced the task to a handful of visual signals he could reproduce exactly the same way every time. A flat palm lowered toward the floor meant sit. 2 fingers curling toward his chest meant come. 1 raised palm meant wait. A broad sweep outward meant all right, release. A firm horizontal hand meant stop. David practiced them in the kitchen mirror before trying them with Cooper, which was humiliating enough that he made sure Laura never learned about it. Cooper learned the first signal in less than a day, though David refused to call that proof of genius because chicken remained heavily involved. The puppy would plant his oversized rear on the floor, stare intensely at David's fingers, receive the reward, and immediately stand again to see whether repeating the performance might produce another piece. "You're not learning obedience," David told him. "You're operating a vending machine." Cooper wagged. The more David watched, the more distinctions appeared. When Cooper failed to respond because he was facing away, that was lack of information. When Cooper flattened his body after a sudden movement near his blind side, that was fear. But when Cooper watched David give the signal for off while lying illegally across the sofa, blinked twice, then deliberately rested his chin on the cushion, that was something else entirely. "There you are," David muttered. "That one's personality." Cooper thumped his tail once without moving. Oddly, discovering genuine stubbornness relieved David. It gave Cooper back some moral agency. The puppy was not a collection of limitations. He was still capable of being an irritating little thief. David also changed how he approached Cooper physically. If the puppy slept with his back turned, David no longer reached down unexpectedly. He stamped one heel lightly against the wooden floor, so the vibration traveled through the boards. At first, Cooper woke sharply anyway, but after several days the response softened. His head would lift, eyes search, and then settle when he saw David. At night, David installed a simple routine with the porch light. 2 quick flashes meant come inside. The first evening, Cooper stared at the changing light as if the house itself had developed a nervous disorder. The second evening, he came halfway to the door and stopped to investigate a moth. By the 5th, he understood. David stood inside, flicked the switch twice, and watched the black and tan puppy abandon the yard and trot toward him. No voice, no whistle, no frustration. Just a message Cooper could actually receive. The blue painter's tape expanded with the new language. David marked a rectangle beside the water bowl, a resting area near the living room wall, and a narrow line Cooper was not supposed to cross when David cooked. It looked ridiculous. Laura, when she visited, stood in the doorway and surveyed the floor. "You're zoning your dog. Visual boundaries. He has more municipal planning than half of Charlottesville. Laugh all you want, it works." At that exact moment, Cooper stepped across the kitchen line, stole a dish towel hanging from the oven handle, and ran. Laura folded her arms. Remarkable system. David chased him halfway around the dining table before remembering himself. He stopped, moved into Cooper's field of vision, raised the stop signal, then offered the release cue toward one of Cooper's toys. Cooper considered both options, kept the towel for another 3 seconds, then dropped it. Laura raised one eyebrow. He negotiated. He delayed compliance. That's Navy language for negotiated. David tried not to smile. A few days later, he went to second draft to help Laura finish arranging the front room. The electrical work had been completed in sections, and although the expense still bothered her, the shop had finally begun to look less like demolition and more like intention. The old letterpress stood near the back wall, heavy and black, with worn metal edges and a large flywheel polished smooth by decades of hands. Tall shelves held cream paper, envelopes, ink tins, and boxes of type. Laura wanted a central display table angled toward the front window, the checkout desk farther back, and the paper shelves along the left wall. David thought the arrangement was inefficient. He had drawn a better one: wider entry lane, shorter path to the register, clearer line between merchandise and workspace.
He opened his mouth to explain, then stopped. Laura noticed immediately. "Are you unwell?" David pulled the roll of blue painter's tape from his tool bag. "3 options." "3? You pick." He marked outlines on the wooden floor, his preferred layout, Laura's preferred layout, and a compromise. Laura walked between them slowly, imagining the room filled with people rather than measuring it in feet. Cooper, who had been permitted to lie near the doorway, followed her movements with his eyes. Laura finally pointed to her original arrangement. David stared at it. "You hate it," she said. "I don't hate it. You've got that vein in your forehead. It creates a choke point. It creates a place where people stop and look. People don't like being obstructed. They're not invading Normandy, David. They're buying stationery." He almost argued. The counterpoint formed perfectly in his mind. Then he remembered the phone call. Listen first. Why that arrangement? Laura's expression changed slightly. She walked to the taped outline of the display table. "Because when someone enters, I don't want the register to be the first thing they see. I want them to see paper, texture, something somebody made with their hands. I want the shop to feel like they're allowed to wander before anyone asks them to buy." David looked around again. He still thought his layout moved bodies more efficiently, but Laura was not trying to move bodies efficiently. "All right," he said. Laura waited for the correction that usually followed. It did not come. 1 week later, during a small preview opening, David stood near the back and watched 6 visitors enter over the course of an hour. An older couple paused naturally at the angled display. 2 women drifted toward the paper shelves without blocking anyone. Another customer circled the table, found a stack of hand-printed cards, and stayed long enough to ask Laura how they were made. Nobody seemed confused by the longer path to the register. Nobody needed the room to behave like David's drawing. Laura passed him carrying a box. "Don't strain anything." "What?" "Admitting I was right." "I haven't admitted anything." "You're thinking it very loudly." David looked at the customers moving through the room and felt something unfamiliar, being wrong without feeling diminished. For most of his life, error had carried consequence. Miss a detail, somebody could get hurt. Misjudge timing, a team could fail. Somewhere along the way, he had allowed that professional truth to invade spaces where being wrong was merely being human. That evening, a man from David's training unit stopped by his house briefly to return a set of manuals. David kept the visit short because Cooper was still learning how to handle people entering unexpectedly. The visitor moved from the entryway toward the living room, passing behind Cooper before David could redirect the flow. Cooper stiffened at once. His head swung around, body low, eyes wide. Weeks earlier, David might have grabbed his collar, forced him into a sit, and demanded calm as proof that a situation was under control. He did not. David stepped where Cooper could see him, raised the familiar wait signal, then he pointed toward the blue taped square beside the sofa. Cooper remained frozen. David did not repeat himself more forcefully. The visitor stopped moving. For several seconds, nothing happened. Cooper looked at the stranger, then at David's hand, then at the blue square. Slowly, he walked toward it. One paw entered, then another. He turned twice and lay down. David had no chicken in his pocket, no leash in his hand, no physical pressure on Cooper's body. The puppy simply remained there, watching David and the visitor from a place he understood. Something loosened in David's chest. He had once believed obedience was the purest evidence that communication had succeeded. A command was given, a command was followed. The chain was clean. But Cooper had not obeyed because David overpowered uncertainty. He had chosen the place because David had finally made himself understandable enough to trust. And David understood, perhaps for the first time, that trust and obedience could look almost identical from across a room, while being built from entirely different things. The first real heat of summer had reached Charlottesville, turning the afternoons bright and heavy, while thunderstorms gathered beyond the Blue Ridge and disappeared before deciding whether to break. Nearly 2 months had passed since David Morgan brought Cooper home,
and the 4-month-old German Shepherd puppy, who had once seemed mostly paws and ears, was already stretching into a longer, stronger body. His black saddle had deepened against the tan of his legs, his chest had broadened slightly, and even the ear that used to fold sideways now stood upright more often than not. Cooper had learned David's hand signals well enough that ordinary life no longer felt like a daily argument conducted in two incompatible languages. He came when he saw the curling fingers. He waited for the raised palm most of the time. 2 flashes of the porch light brought him inside, unless a squirrel had recently committed some offense against the backyard. He also continued to steal socks, occupy furniture without permission, and test whether rules still applied on Tuesdays. David had begun to appreciate the distinction. That morning, Cooper was asleep beneath the dining table when David opened an email carrying a subject line that 6 months earlier would have made him answer before finishing his coffee. The message came from Commander Robert Hayes, 51, a career naval officer David had known professionally for nearly a decade. Hayes was a tall, rangy man with close-cropped gray hair, a narrow, weathered face, and the permanently tired blue eyes of someone who had spent years being responsible for decisions other people discussed only after they went wrong. He rarely wasted words and never offered opportunities as favors. The position was a 2-year assignment with a larger training portfolio, oversight responsibilities, and regular travel between facilities. It would put David in rooms where future command selections were discussed. More responsibility, more influence, better career trajectory, the sort of offer men in his position were expected to want. David read the message twice. Then he did what David did whenever uncertainty entered a room. He created categories. Travel days per month, estimated nights away, boarding costs, in-home sitter costs, Laura's availability, veterinary access, training continuity, emergency coverage, Cooper's tolerance for unfamiliar handlers. Within 40 minutes, he had built a spreadsheet with 4 tabs and conditional formatting. Cooper woke during this process, crawled from beneath the table, and placed his chin on David's thigh. David looked down. "You're becoming a line item." Cooper stared at him. An expensive one. The dog nudged David's wrist until his hand moved off the keyboard. It would have been easy to tell himself that the decision was about a dog. That was cleaner. Sentimental, perhaps, but clean. Yet David knew the problem was wider than Cooper. For 23 years, his professional life had been shaped by the assumption that advancement was inherently forward. More responsibility meant growth. More trust meant success. Turning away from a stronger position required an explanation. Accepting it did not. Nobody asked a man why he wanted the promotion. They asked why he did not. That imbalance bothered David now in a way it never had before. Later that afternoon, he received a call from Claire Bennett, a coordinator with Piedmont Deaf Dog Network, an organization Dr. Hannah Pierce had recommended as a resource. Claire was 44, medium height and athletic, with short chestnut hair curling around her ears, light olive skin, and a quick, practical expression that made her look as if she had already considered the next 3 questions before anyone asked the first. She had spent 15 years working with deaf and hard-of-hearing dogs after adopting one herself in her 20s, and she had developed little patience for 2 opposite kinds of people, those who treated disabled dogs as hopeless and those who treated disability as something love magically erased. Claire had met David and Cooper once during a basic visual communication session and knew how much progress they had made. David told her about the potential assignment without dressing it up. "I could arrange care," he said. "I'm not asking whether I could." "Good," Claire replied. "Because you could." David waited. "There are excellent sitters, experienced handlers, structured boarding, plenty of people make travel work." But Cooper is still young, and predictable communication matters more for him than for some dogs. New people aren't impossible. Frequent changes just cost him more adjustment. David leaned back. "So you think I shouldn't take it?" "I didn't say that. You're thinking it." Claire laughed softly. "You military people really dislike answers that don't come with arrows." Then her voice became more serious. My job isn't to tell you what your career should be. My job is to tell you what Cooper needs. If those two things stop fitting, our network can help find him a home with experience in deaf dogs. That isn't abandonment if it's done responsibly. David said nothing. The idea landed harder than he expected. Claire continued, "And keeping him isn't automatically the moral choice either. People sometimes keep animals because letting go would make them feel guilty, even when the animal would do better elsewhere. Love can become selfish in both directions." After the call ended, David left the spreadsheet open for another hour without touching it. Second draft handed him the same question from another direction. Laura called him over that evening and placed a contract on the long work table near the restored letterpress. The shop was finally beginning to resemble the place she had described, rather than the construction site David had feared. Handmade cards stood in shallow wooden trays, samples of textured paper hung from brass clips, and the central display table David once disliked now naturally slowed people as they entered. Laura wore a cream blouse beneath a dark green apron streaked with ink, her auburn and silver hair twisted loosely behind her head. She had received an offer from Hearth and Home Mercantile, a regional retail chain interested in carrying second draft stationery in more than 30 stores. The buyer, Janice Coleman, was 58, a polished woman with a smooth silver blonde bob, careful makeup, and the composed professionalism of someone who had spent decades judging products by whether strangers would buy them. Janice had praised Laura's workmanship, then sent specifications requiring simplified designs, standardized colors, faster production, larger batches, and seasonal collections built around proven sales categories. 30 stores, David said after reading the contract. Possibly more next year. Laura nodded. Minimum orders would cover most of your fixed costs. I know. You've been worried about fixed costs for 3 months. I know that too. David looked at her. So what's the problem? Laura turned one of her own cards over between her fingers. It showed an uneven letterpress impression of wildflowers, the ink slightly darker on one edge because she had deliberately printed it that way. They want 12 designs, same size, same paper stock, 4 approved color families. I'd spend most of my time producing what sells for them instead of making what I opened this place to make. Businesses sell things people want. Thank you, Harvard. I'm serious. So am I. She tapped the contract. This could make the shop safer. It could also turn it into another job where someone else decides what I make, and I get very efficient at pretending that doesn't bother me. David saw the irony before Laura had to point it out. On paper, her answer was obvious to him. Take the contract, stabilize the business, build reserves, negotiate later from strength. On paper, his own answer was equally obvious. Take the assignment, advance, arrange competent care for Cooper, solve the logistics. Laura watched his face. You got an offer too, didn't you? David looked up. How did you know? You only stare at somebody else's financial opportunity like that when you're hiding one of your own. He told her. She listened without immediately telling him what to do, which irritated him slightly, because he had apparently trained his sister into emotional maturity faster than himself. 2 years? She asked. Yes. A lot of travel? Potentially. Good for your career? Very. Laura nodded. Then you've got a beautiful contract too. David glanced down at hers. That's not the same thing. No, yours comes with better uniforms. He almost smiled. Laura became quiet. Maybe the question isn't whether the opportunity is good. David waited. Maybe it's whether the life attached to it is yours. He hated the sentence because it resisted measurement. Driving home, David kept returning to it. The life attached to it. People often talked about decisions as if they selected individual objects, a job, a house, a marriage, a dog. In reality, every choice arrived dragging an entire, ordinary life behind it. Tuesday mornings, missed dinners, airport parking, vet appointments, exhaustion, routines, people waiting for calls, animals waiting beside doors. David had always been skilled at evaluating the visible opportunity. He was less practiced at evaluating the invisible daily life required to sustain it. That night, Cooper occupied nearly 3/4 of the sofa. He had grown long enough that one hind leg stretched directly across David's usual seat, while his head rested against a cushion he had technically been forbidden to claim weeks ago. David sat at the remaining corner with his laptop balanced against one knee. The email from Commander Hayes remained open. He read the responsibilities again. Then the travel expectations. Then the paragraph about long-term leadership development. Every line still looked good. Nothing in the offer had become less valuable simply because David was uncertain. Cooper slept through the entire deliberation, one paw twitching against the cushion. He did not know there was a career decision on the screen. He did not know another experienced home could potentially be found for him. He did not know that David had already calculated 3 workable arrangements that would technically allow both dog and assignment to coexist. David's fingers hovered over the keyboard. He could make it work. For most of his life, that sentence had ended the argument. Tonight, it began one. David did not decline the position. He did not accept it either. He closed the laptop and set it on the coffee table. Cooper remained asleep. For once, David allowed an important question to survive the night without forcing it to become an answer. The question David had allowed to survive the night did not become easier in the morning. If anything, daylight made it more practical. And practical problems were dangerous territory for a man who could turn anxiety into logistics before breakfast. Charlottesville woke under a warm summer haze, the streets already bright by mid-morning, cicadas beginning their dry mechanical chorus in the trees. Cooper lay beneath the kitchen table chewing a rubber ring, while David opened the email from Commander Hayes again. He did not answer. Instead, he opened a blank document and typed a title: Cooper, Care and Handling, Notes. What began as 1 page became 5 before noon. Feeding schedule, water, walks, hand signals, what to do if Cooper failed to respond, what not to do if he was sleeping, how to approach from the front, how to use floor vibration, how to flash the porch light, which treats worked best, which treats worked too well and turned the dog into what David described as a criminal with motivation. He added the veterinarian's number, Claire Bennett's number, emergency clinic information, medication history, preferred harness, backup harness, spare leash, location of vaccination records, and a diagram showing the blue tape zones in the house. By lunch, the document was 14 pages. By evening, it was 23. 2 days later, it was 29. David told himself this proved the new assignment could work. He could travel. Cooper could stay with Laura. Laura could follow the system. If Laura was unavailable, there could be a trained sitter. If the sitter cancelled, there would be a backup. If Cooper became overstimulated, the instructions covered that. If he refused food, that too. If he slipped a leash, there were procedures. David built contingencies until the decision began to resemble a military exercise with a dog at the center. What he did not notice was that the more pages he wrote, the less he trusted anyone else to live without them. Laura noticed immediately. She came to David's house on Saturday carrying 2 iced coffees and a paper bag from a bakery near Second Draft. She wore dark jeans and a loose white shirt, dotted with tiny ink stains, her silver-streaked auburn hair pinned up carelessly at the back of her head. Cooper met her at the door, saw the familiar hand signal she had learned for hello, and bumped his shoulder against her knee before turning his attention to the bakery bag. Laura looked down. At least one man in this family is happy to see me. He smells butter. I choose to interpret it as love. David handed her the printed document. Laura looked at the thickness of it. What is this? Cooper. He wrote a memoir? Care instructions. Laura opened the first page, then the second. She read silently for perhaps 30 seconds, flipped ahead to page 7, then page 12. You made a table for his bowel movements. It's a tracking reference. David, it matters if there's a sudden change. There is a section called Unexpected Environmental Variables. He startles when he doesn't see movement coming. Laura kept turning pages. You have a backup plan for the backup leash? The clip failed once. I remember. David heard the amusement in her voice and disliked it. This isn't funny. Laura closed the packet. No, she said, it isn't. The change in tone irritated him more than the joke had. You said you'd help if I traveled. I said I'd learn his signals. This tells you everything you need. No, this tells me you don't trust me to figure out anything without you. That's not what it says. It's 29 pages, David. 28 and a half. Laura stared at him. He regretted the correction immediately. Cooper, sensing movement rather than tension, picked up one of David's socks from beside the laundry basket and walked quietly out of the room. Neither sibling noticed. Laura placed a packet on the counter. Have you decided to take the assignment? No. But you've already planned my life around it. I'm giving you information so you can make an informed decision. You gave me a manual before you asked whether I actually want Cooper here for weeks at a time. David's jaw tightened. You said you'd help. Help, not become part of a staffing model. That's not fair. Neither is handing me 29 pages and acting like the problem is solved because the margins are neat. David felt heat rise in his chest. I'm trying to make sure he's safe, I know. You don't know what can happen if someone approaches him wrong. I know enough to learn. He's not a normal dog. Laura's face changed. David heard the sentence the moment it left his mouth. Cooper appeared in the doorway with the stolen sock hanging from his mouth. Laura looked toward him, then back at David. No, he's not a dog who fits your original instructions. That isn't what I meant. I know what you meant. And I also know what you do when something scares you. David folded his arms. Apparently, this is going to become another amateur psychological evaluation. Laura's eyes narrowed. Fine. You want the professional version? Call somebody. But the sister version is free. I didn't ask. That's the problem. Nobody ever has to ask. You walk into the room already carrying the solution. David stepped away from the counter. You're angry because I made instructions? I'm angry because you keep pretending this is about instructions. What is it about then? Laura was quiet for several seconds. When she answered, the anger in her voice had thinned into something more dangerous because it sounded almost sad. You don't just like being useful, David.
You need people to need you. He laughed once without humor. That's ridiculous.
Is it?
Yes.
Then why does every problem become yours?
Because people call me when they need help.
And when they don't?
David said nothing. Laura continued.
You fixed Dad's roof before he asked. You reorganized my shop when I asked you to move furniture. You turned a dog into 29 pages because you can't tolerate the possibility that somebody else might take care of him differently and still do it well.
That's called responsibility.
No. Responsibility is making sure Cooper is safe. This is something else.
David's expression hardened.
You've made reckless decisions your entire life and called them independence.
Laura went still.
The sentence landed exactly where David intended it to, and he hated himself almost immediately for knowing where to aim. Good, Laura said quietly.
Now we're finally being honest.
She walked to the work table, opened her purse and pulled out a folded bank statement. David looked at it. Laura slid it across the table. I have $11,400 left in the savings account. David's anger vanished so quickly it felt like missing a step in the dark. What? You heard me. You had almost $70,000. I know. How much went into the shop? Most of it. Laura, don't. You told me you were keeping a reserve. I was. You have $11,000. I can read. David grabbed the statement. Rent deposits, equipment restoration, electrical work, paper inventory, insurance, custom shelving, printing supplies. The numbers were not impossible, but they were far worse than he had understood. Why didn't you tell me? Laura laughed bitterly. Because this is exactly what would have happened. What would have happened?
Me noticing you've burned through most of your savings?
You telling me to stop. Maybe somebody should have. There, that. What? You think because you're scared, you automatically become right. David stared at her. Laura's voice trembled now, but she kept going. I knew this was risky. I knew I might fail. And I also knew if I told you exactly how far I'd gone, you'd build me a safer life and hand it back like a gift. That would be better than losing everything. For you. The room fell silent. Cooper had dropped the sock and was now lying near the hallway, watching both of them with alert brown eyes. David noticed that neither raised voice had made him understand the argument. To Cooper, anger without visible meaning was probably only movement. Laura sat down. I'm terrified, she said. David had expected another accusation. Instead, she rubbed both hands over her face. I wake up at 3 in the morning, wondering if I've done the stupidest thing of my life. And then I go to the shop, and I love being there. Both things are true. I didn't tell you because I was afraid you'd make me choose the safe answer before I had the courage to find out whether this could work. David lowered himself into the chair opposite her. For several moments, neither spoke. He looked again at the bank statement. You need to cut costs. I know. You should have told me sooner. I know. And I probably would have tried to shut the whole thing down. Laura looked at him. David exhaled. I know. Something in her shoulders loosened. The fight had stripped away the useful roles they usually played. David could no longer be the competent brother rescuing the impulsive sister. Laura could no longer be the brave, free spirit correcting the controlling man. They had both built identities around ways of avoiding fear. David controlled uncertainty until everyone depended on his competence. Laura outran uncertainty and called the distance freedom. They spent the next hour going through second draft's expenses together. This time, David did not categorize anything without asking first. Laura agreed to delay a custom paper cabinet, reduce 2 inventory orders, postpone new exterior signage, and sell an unused piece of equipment she had bought too early. David suggested canceling 3 other expenses. Laura kept one of them. David disagreed and did not reopen the argument. Then Laura picked up the Cooper manual. I'll learn the signals, she said. The important ones. Come, wait, stop. And whatever means, give me back my underwear. There isn't one. There should be. David looked toward Cooper. The puppy was chewing the stolen sock again. Maybe you're right. Later that evening, after Laura left, David sat alone at the kitchen table with the 29-page manual in front of him. He read the first page, then the 5th, then the emergency flowchart he had spent 40 minutes formatting. He finally understood what Laura had meant. The document was not only about Cooper's safety. It was evidence. Evidence that David remained necessary. If every detail lived inside his head, every person caring for Cooper still needed David somewhere behind the process. The realization made him uncomfortable, because it reached beyond the dog and beyond the job offer. One day the Navy would stop asking him to solve things. Young men would stop waiting for his judgment. Promotions would stop existing. His phone would ring less. Somewhere beneath all the discipline and capability, David had never asked who he would be when nobody required him to be useful. He tore the manual in half, then again, and again. Cooper lifted his head at the movement. David took a single clean sheet of paper and wrote, food, water, 3 hand signals, vet number, trust him a little. The next morning, Laura stopped by before opening second draft. David handed her the page. She read it once. Then she looked at him. That last line, she said, is that for Cooper or for me? David considered the question. Probably all of us. Laura folded the paper and put it in her bag. For once, David let her leave without explaining anything else. By the time second draft held its preview opening, Charlottesville had moved into the thick green heart of summer. The morning was bright without being harsh, and the maples along the narrow street barely moved in the warm air. Laura had deliberately avoided calling the day a grand opening. There were no balloons, no ribbon, and no photographer waiting to capture a manufactured beginning. She had invited a small number of neighbors, former co-workers and local customers, so she could learn what went wrong before strangers began discovering those things for her. David approved of this logic so thoroughly that Laura immediately accused him of corrupting her. "Next, I'll be making contingency folders," she said, while arranging hand-printed cards near the front display. "Then it's over for you." David was carrying a water bowl toward the back corner.
"I'm not taking responsibility for your decline."
Cooper followed close behind him, now nearly 7 months old and beginning to lose the awkward proportions of early puppyhood. His shoulders had broadened, his black and tan coat had grown dense and glossy. Both ears now stood erect, and his once oversized paws finally looked as if the rest of his body intended to catch up. He remained young enough to investigate every paper bag as potential food, and old enough that his size made strangers assume more maturity than he actually possessed. That mismatch worried David more than it used to. A small puppy could make mistakes people forgave. A large German shepherd was judged by the consequences of those mistakes. David had brought Cooper during the quietest part of the preview, after discussing the idea with Laura and making sure there would be an exit route if the shop became crowded. Near the back wall, he marked a rectangular resting area with blue painter's tape, placed a mat and water bowl inside it, and positioned it where Cooper could see most of the room without being trapped against a wall. Months earlier, David would have called the arrangement controlled. Now he thought of it as giving Cooper enough information to make good choices. The difference seemed small until one had lived inside it. For the first hour, Cooper did well. He watched customers enter, occasionally lifting his head when the floorboards carried vibration beneath their steps. Laura used the hand signal for "wait" twice and appeared ridiculously pleased when Cooper stayed on the mat. David resisted correcting the angle of her wrist. "You saw that?" she whispered. "He waited." "For me. He also watched you drop cheese 20 minutes ago." Laura frowned at Cooper. "Our relationship is built on deeper principles than cheese." Cooper licked his nose. Visitors drifted through slowly. Among them was Rachel Miller, 36, a local elementary school librarian with shoulder-length brown hair, a round, open face, and the practical habit of carrying too many things in one canvas tote. Rachel had the patient voice of someone who spent her working life answering questions that began with "why?" and ended somewhere no adult had expected. With her came her 7-year-old son, Noah, a thin boy with sandy hair that refused to lie flat, pale knees showing beneath cargo shorts, and a restless physical curiosity that made standing still seem personally offensive. Noah noticed Cooper within 30 seconds. "Mom, dog!" "I see him. Can I pet him?" "Ask first." David appreciated Rachel immediately for that. Noah approached from the front while David crouched beside Cooper. "He doesn't hear very well," David explained, "so let him see you first. Hold your hand low and don't reach over his head." Noah followed the instructions carefully. Cooper sniffed his fingers, then returned his attention to David. "He doesn't like me," Noah said. "He doesn't know you. That's the same thing." "No," David said. "That's a useful difference." Rachel smiled faintly, and Noah wandered back toward a display of illustrated cards. The interaction had gone well enough that David allowed some tension to leave his shoulders. That was the mistake, not bringing Cooper, not allowing Noah near him, but letting one good moment persuade David that the environment had become predictable. 20 minutes later, the shop was busier. 3 customers stood near the central display. Laura was answering a question beside the press. David had moved several feet away from Cooper to carry a box of envelopes behind the counter. Noah had been examining a wooden tray of alphabet blocks Laura used to demonstrate old typefaces. When one rode beneath a table, he chased it around the far side and came up behind Cooper. David saw him too late. Noah ran the final few steps and, with the uncomplicated affection children sometimes offer before learning that affection also requires permission, wrapped both arms around Cooper's shoulders from behind. Cooper had no warning. His entire body jerked. He spun sharply, pulling free of the embrace, and a low growl broke from his chest. His lips tightened enough to show the edge of his teeth. Rachel moved faster than David expected. She caught Noah around the waist and pulled him backward. Several people stopped talking. A woman near the card display took 2 quick steps away. Noah's face had gone white. He had not been bitten. Cooper had not lunged after him. But fear had arrived anyway, and fear did not need an injury to become real. "Mom? I've got you." David was already beside Cooper. His oldest instinct rose with astonishing speed. Explain. Defend. Cooper was deaf. Noah had approached from behind. The dog had been startled. No bite had occurred. There were reasons, context, facts. Then another customer, an older man near the door, said, "A dog like that shouldn't be around children." David felt his jaw tighten. Months ago he would have answered immediately. He might even have been technically right. Instead he looked at Noah. The boy was holding his mother's hand now, frightened by an animal he had been happily touching less than half an hour earlier. David turned to Rachel. "I'm sorry." Rachel looked surprised. "I should have kept more distance once the room got busy," David continued. "Cooper has severe hearing loss. He needs to see people approaching him, especially from behind. Noah didn't know that." "I ran up," Noah whispered. David looked at him. "You did. And next time you ask again before hugging a dog, even one you already met." Rachel nodded. "That's fair. But I'm responsible for Cooper," David said. "He shouldn't have been in a position where that could happen." There was no applause. The older man near the door did not suddenly reconsider his opinion. Rachel did not tell David he was a wonderful dog owner. Laura did not rescue the moment with a speech. The silence remained uncomfortable for a while, as real silences often did. David gave Cooper the hand signal for come and led him outside. On the sidewalk, Cooper shook his entire body from nose to tail and then looked up at David as if nothing important had occurred. That almost made David laugh. Animals did not carry moral narratives about their own reactions. Cooper did not know he had embarrassed David. He did not know strangers might label him dangerous. He had been frightened, he had warned, and now the moment was over. People were the ones who built stories around behavior. Sometimes those stories protected animals. Sometimes they endangered them. Calling every fearful reaction sweet because one loved the animal was no kinder than calling every fearful animal vicious. David crouched in front of Cooper. "You're scared a kid." Cooper watched his face. "And he scared you." The dog blinked. Both can be true. David had spent years preferring situations where one side could be clearly correct. Life had become more complicated since Cooper arrived, not because the dog had taught him mystical wisdom, but because Cooper kept presenting problems that refused to become morally convenient. Later, after the shop quieted again, Laura came outside holding a cream-colored order sheet. "You all right?" she asked. "Yes." "Cooper?" "Fine." Laura sat beside him on the low brick ledge. Rachel stayed. David glanced toward the window. "She bought 6 cards," Laura added. "Noah picked one with a ridiculous purple bird." "That sounds expensive." Laura smiled. "There he is." Then she handed him the order sheet. A local family had commissioned 160 handmade wedding invitations, response cards, and matching envelopes. Laura had designed a sample with pressed wildflower shapes, deep blue lettering, and deliberately uneven impressions that made every card slightly different. David read the quantity. His mind automatically calculated paper cost, labor hours, ink, margin, production capacity. The question reached his mouth. "How much?" He stopped. Laura waited. David looked at the design in her hands. Her eyes were brighter than they had been when she showed him the regional chain contract. "Are you happy?" Laura's expression softened. "Yes." David handed the page back. Then, "Congratulations." "That's it?" "That's it." She narrowed her eyes suspiciously. "Who are you and where is my brother? Don't ruin it." By late afternoon, most of the visitors had gone. Behind second draft was a fenced patch of grass, bordered by an old brick wall and 2 large maple trees. David took Cooper there before driving home. He unclipped the long training line only after checking the gate twice. Cooper wandered outward, nose to the grass, eventually moving perhaps 30 feet away. David watched him. Months earlier he would have called. The word would have crossed empty air and disappeared. Now David waited until Cooper happened to turn enough to see him. He raised one hand and curled 2 fingers toward his chest. "Come." Cooper stopped. For 2 seconds he simply stared. Then his head turned toward something in the grass. David did not repeat the signal. He waited. Cooper looked back. Then he ran. The German Shepherd crossed the grass in long, uneven strides and stopped directly in front of David, breathing hard, eyes bright. There was no leash pulling him, no piece of chicken waiting in David's fingers. Cooper had not become safe in every situation. He had not become obedient in every situation. The uncomfortable scene inside second draft had proved exactly that. But he had understood what David was asking. And this time, given the choice, he had come back. Nearly a year after Cooper first walked into David Morgan's house, autumn had returned to Charlottesville with cool mornings, clear afternoons, and the first rusty leaves collecting along the edges of the sidewalks. The German Shepherd, who had once been small enough to curl against David's thigh, was now 15 months old, tall through the shoulders, deep-chested, and almost 80 pounds of black and tan confidence. His coat had grown thick and glossy. Both ears stood sharply upright, and the oversized puppy paws had finally become proportional to the rest of him. Maturity had improved many things. It had not improved Cooper's respect for furniture. The sofa belonged to him unless David presented a compelling argument. Socks continued disappearing under suspicious circumstances. The kitchen remained technically restricted, though Cooper occasionally planted both front paws 1 inch beyond the old blue boundary and looked directly at David as if requesting a judicial review. Worst of all, he had discovered that pretending not to notice a hand signal was much easier than pretending not to hear a voice. "Off," David signed one Saturday morning after finding Cooper sprawled across the sofa. Cooper looked directly at the signal, turned his head toward the window, and became deeply interested in a squirrel that had not existed 5 seconds earlier. David stared at him. "That is not a hearing problem." Cooper's tail thumped once against the cushion. Some things, David had learned, were simply personality. Months earlier, David had declined the 2-year assignment Commander Hayes offered. He had done it without invoking Cooper as an excuse, which mattered to him more than he expected. The email he sent had been short: gratitude for the opportunity, acknowledgement of what the position represented, and a clear statement that the travel requirements no longer matched the professional and personal life he intended to build. Hayes had responded with 3 sentences, none of them disappointed. That had surprised David. He had spent weeks constructing the decision as though careers were narrow bridges, and refusing one turn meant stepping off entirely. Instead, another opportunity came several months later, a stateside training assignment with a steadier schedule, responsibility for developing younger instructors, and enough operational complexity to keep David challenged without requiring him to spend half his year in airports and temporary quarters. He accepted. The work was not smaller, it was simply shaped differently. That distinction had taken David 43 years to understand. People often praised sacrifice because sacrifice made a cleaner story. A man gave something up for someone he loved, and everyone knew where to place the emotion. But David did not feel that he had sacrificed his career for Cooper. He had chosen one version of his career over another because one life fitted him better. Cooper had influenced the decision, certainly. So had Laura. So had age. So had the uncomfortable realization that advancement was not automatically synonymous with direction. Calling the choice a sacrifice would have made David sound nobler than he felt. It had simply been a decision about what he wanted his ordinary Tuesdays to look like. Second Draft survived its first year in much the same unglamorous way most small businesses survived anything, one invoice at a time. Laura never became the regional stationery success the retail contract had promised. She also never went broke, though some months came close enough to make both siblings irritable. The wedding order from the preview opening brought 2 referrals. Those brought another small order. A local florist began carrying a rotating set of Laura's cards. During December, she sold enough holiday stationery to replace the paper cutter she had been threatening with retirement since summer. January was terrible. February was slightly less terrible. In March, she sent David a photograph of the monthly accounts with the message, "Black ink, actual black ink." David replied with a thumbs up and resisted asking what percentage of her outstanding invoices remained unpaid. Progress occasionally required heroic restraint. Their relationship had not transformed into perfect late-life sibling harmony. David still believed Laura carried too much inventory. Laura still believed David could make a grocery list feel like federal policy. Once, while repairing a loose bearing on the letterpress, David suggested she move a cabinet 6 inches to improve access. Laura asked whether the Navy had officially declared war on cabinets. They argued for 12 minutes, stopped before either said something unnecessarily cruel, ate sandwiches in silence, and resumed the repair. Months earlier, David would have considered an unresolved disagreement unfinished business. Laura would have interpreted any advice as proof he was trying to reclaim control. Now both had become slightly better at leaving some things imperfect. Laura sometimes asked, "Do you have an opinion or a command?" David sometimes answered, "Opinion." Occasionally, she still ignored it. Somehow, the earth continued rotating. Laura had become competent with Cooper's essential hand signals as well. She watched him when David had overnight training duties, and Cooper had learned that the rules at Laura's house differed in several important respects, particularly regarding the sofa and the probability of receiving pieces of cheese. David objected to both. Laura ignored him. Cooper flourished under this divided government. The blue painter's tape remained longer than David expected. Some sections had been replaced as they wore out. Others faded into the wooden floor until their edges collected dust. The rectangle near Cooper's resting mat had become unnecessary months ago. Cooper knew where to settle when visitors arrived. The kitchen line was now more tradition than enforcement. One Saturday afternoon, David walked through the house carrying a trash bag and suddenly noticed how much tape remained from the earliest months. He crouched near the kitchen and lifted one corner with his fingernail. Cooper appeared immediately. David pulled away the first strip. The dog stared at the exposed floor. "You'll survive." Another strip came up beside the water bowl, then the old resting square. David moved from room to room, removing pieces that had once seemed essential. Each one reminded him of a different phase, not sentimentally but practically. Here was where Cooper learned to wait. There was where David had redirected him 40 times before realizing the dog simply could not see him from that angle. Beside the hallway was the line Cooper used to stand across deliberately, half his body legal and half criminal. Cooper followed the entire operation with growing suspicion. When David removed the final kitchen strip, Cooper stepped onto the exact place where it had been and sat. David looked at him. "Congratulations, the border is open." Cooper scratched behind one ear. Under the desk in David's small home office, one piece remained. It was only 6 inches long, its blue faded almost gray, edges worn by thousands of crossings from paws and boots. David reached down to remove it, then stopped. There was no reason to keep it. There was also no reason he needed to remove it. So he left it there. Not every object required a lesson. Not every old thing needed to become a symbol or be preserved behind glass. David simply liked seeing it beneath the desk. That evening, Laura was still working at Second Draft. From David's front window, he could see the soft square of light from the shop farther down the street, glowing beyond the darkening trees. He had texted earlier, complaining about a rush order, and then 4 minutes later sent another message saying she secretly loved it. David had responded that both statements could apparently be true. He sat at his desk with the laptop open. A new message from the Navy concerned possible responsibilities for the following year. Not a crisis, not a promotion demanding an immediate answer, just another fork in a road that would continue producing forks, whether David liked it or not. Before he could finish reading, Cooper entered. The German shepherd placed his front paws on the edge of the desk. "Don't." Cooper climbed higher. David gave a signal for down. Cooper saw it perfectly. Then he lowered nearly 80 pounds of dog directly across the laptop keyboard. The screen vanished beneath black and tan fur. David leaned back. "You know this is my house, right?" Cooper yawned. David laughed. He made the hand signal they had developed for move over. Cooper watched carefully, then shifted perhaps 2 inches. David stared at the tiny space Cooper had generously returned. "That's incredibly thoughtful." He pulled his chair closer instead of moving the dog. Outside, second draft remained lit. The Navy message waited somewhere beneath Cooper's chest. Tomorrow, David would answer it. Tomorrow, Laura might make another financial decision that irritated him. Tomorrow, Cooper might ignore a perfectly visible signal because a squirrel offered a more persuasive argument. None of them had been repaired. Laura remained impulsive enough to frighten her brother. David remained capable of turning concern into control if he stopped paying attention. Cooper remained a hearing-impaired German shepherd whose limitations required real management and whose personality required even more patience. The house was not peaceful because those things had disappeared. It was peaceful because nobody required them to disappear before there could be room for one another. Beneath the desk, the final faded strip of blue tape remained on the floor. Once it had existed to tell Cooper where he could not go. Nearly a year later, it marked nothing at all. David looked down at it, then at the enormous dog occupying his keyboard. Perhaps a home was not built when everything finally stayed where it belonged. Perhaps it began when different lives learned each other's language well enough to make room. Cooper stretched one paw farther across the laptop. David shook his head and moved his chair another inch. It was not a perfect ending. It was simply a life that finally fit the people and the dog who were living it. Maybe the miracle in David and Cooper's story was never that a deaf dog learned to obey. Maybe it was that a man who had spent his life giving instructions finally learned that love sometimes begins with changing the way we speak. People do this to one another more often than we realize. We call someone difficult when they are frightened, distant when they are hurting, stubborn when they simply experience the world differently than we do. We raise our voices when perhaps God is asking us to open our eyes. Cooper was never broken, and David was never meant to fix him. They simply had to learn how to meet somewhere in between. Perhaps that is one of God's quieter miracles, not removing every limitation, but giving us enough patience, humility, and grace to make room for one another anyway. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need that reminder today. Tell us in the comments what Cooper and David taught you, and subscribe for more stories about compassion, faith, and the unexpected ways lives can change. May God bless your home, protect those you love, and give you the wisdom to hear even the messages that arrive without sound.